Chapter 4 of the Adventures of Ferdinand Count Fathom by Tobias Smollett. This recording is in the public domain. It would have been impossible for the mother of our adventurer, such as she hath been described, to sit quietly in her tent, while such an heroic scene was acting. She was no sooner apprised of the general's intention to attack the enemy, than she, as usual, packed up her movables in a waggon, which she committed to the care of a peasant in the neighbourhood, and put herself in motion with the troops, big with the expectation of reacting that part in which she had formerly acquitted herself so much to her advantage. Nay, she by this time looked upon her own presence as a certain omen of success to the cause which she espoused, and in their march to battle actually encouraged the ranks with repeated declarations, importing that she had been eye-witness of 10 decisive engagements, in all of which her friends had been victorious, and imputing such uncommon good fortune to some supernatural quality inherent in her person. Whether or not this confidence contributed to the fortune of the day, by inspiring the soldiers to an uncommon pitch of courage and resolution, I shall not pretend to determine; but certain it is, the victory began from that quarter in which she had posted herself, and no corps in the army behaved with such intrepidity as that which was manifested by those who were favoured with her admonitions and example. For she not only exposed her person to the enemy's fire, with the indifference and deliberation of a veteran, but she is said to have achieved a very conspicuous exploit by the prowess of her single arm. The extremity of the line to which she had attached herself, being assaulted in flank by a body of the Spahis, wheeled about in order to sustain the charge, and received them with such a seasonable fire as brought a great number of turbans to the ground. Among those who fell was one of the chiefs or agas, who had advanced before the rest, with a view to signalize his valour. Our English Penthesilea no sooner saw this Turkish leader drop, than, struck with the magnificence of his own and horse's trappings, she sprung forward to seize them as her prize, and found the aga not dead, though in a good measure disabled by his misfortune, which was entirely owing to the weight of his horse, that, having been killed by a musket ball, lay upon his leg, so that he could not disengage himself. Nevertheless, perceiving the virago approach with full intent, he brandished his scimitar, and tried to intimidate his assailant with a most horrible exclamation; but it was not the dismal yell of a dismounted cavalier, though enforced with a hideous ferocity of countenance, and the menacing gestures with which he waited her approach, that could intimidate such an undaunted she-campaigner. She saw him writhing in the agonies of a situation from which he could not move, and, running towards him with the nimbleness and intrepidity of a Camilla, described a semicircle in the progress of her assault, and attacking him on one side, plunged her well-tried dagger in his throat. The shades of death encompassed him, his life-blood issued at the wound, he fell prone upon the earth, he bit the dust, and having thrice invoked the name of Allah, straight expired. While his destiny was thus fulfilled, his followers began to reel. They seemed dismayed at the fate of their chief, beheld their companions drop like the leaves in autumn, and suddenly halted in the midst of their career. The Imperialists, observing the confusion of the enemy, redoubled their fire, and raising a dreadful shout, advanced in order to improve the advantage they had gained. The Spahis durst not wait the shock of such an encounter. They wheeled to the right about, and clapping spurs to their horses, fled in the utmost disorder. This was actually the circumstance that turned the scale of the battle. The Austrians pursued their good fortune with uncommon impetuosity, and in a few minutes left the field clear for the mother of our hero, who was such an adept in the art of stripping, that in the twinkling of an eye the bodies of the aga and his Arabian lay naked to the skin. It would have been happy for her, had she been contented with these first fruits reaped from the fortune of the day, and retired with her spoils, which were not inconsiderable. But, intoxicated with the glory she had won, enticed by the glittering caparisons that lay scattered on the plain, and without doubt prompted by the secret instinct of her fate, she resolved to seize opportunity by the forelock, and once for all indemnify herself for the many fatigues, hazards, and sorrows she had undergone. Thus determined, she reconnoitred the field, and practised her address so successfully, that in less than half an hour she was loaded with ermine and embroidery, and disposed to retreat with her burden, when her regards were solicited by a splendid bundle, which she descried at some distance lying on the ground. This was no other than an unhappy officer of hussars, who, after having the good fortune to take a Turkish standard, was desperately wounded in the thigh, and obliged to quit his horse. Finding himself in such a helpless condition, he had wrapped his acquisition round his body, that, whatever might happen, he and his glory should not be parted; and thus shrouded, among the dying and the dead, he had observed the progress of our heroine, who stalked about the field like another Atropos, finishing, wherever she came, the work of death. He did not at all doubt that he himself would be visited in the course of her peregrinations, and therefore provided for her reception, with a pistol ready cocked in his hand, while he lay perdu beneath his covert, in all appearance bereft of life. He was not deceived in his prognostic. She no sooner eyed the golden crescent, than, inflamed with curiosity or cupidity, she directed thitherward her steps, and discerning the carcass of a man, from which she thought there would be a necessity for disengaging it, she lifted up her weapon, in order to make sure of her purchase, and in the very instant of discharging her blow, received a brace of bullets in her brain. Thus ended the mortal pilgrimage of this modern Amazon, who, in point of courage, was not inferior to Semiramis, Thamyris, Zenobia, Thalestris, or any boasted heroine of ancient times. It cannot be supposed that this catastrophe made a very deep impression upon the mind of young Ferdinand, who had just then attained the 9th year of his age, and been for a considerable time weaned from her maternal caresses, especially as he felt no wants nor grievances in the family of the Count, who favoured him with a particular share of indulgence, because he perceived in him a spirit of docility, insinuation, and sagacity far above his years. He did not, however, fail to lament the untimely fate of his mother, with such filial expressions of sorrow as still more intimately recommended him to his patron, who, being himself a man of extraordinary benevolence, looked upon the boy as a prodigy of natural affection, and foresaw in his future services a fund of gratitude and attachment, that could not fail to render him a valuable acquisition to his family. In his own country he had often seen connections of that sort, which, having been planted in the infancy of the adherent, had grown up to a surprising pitch of fidelity and friendship, that no temptation could bias, and no danger dissolve. He therefore rejoiced in the hope of seeing his own son accommodated with such a faithful attendant, in the person of young Fathom, on whom he resolved to bestow the same education he had planned for the other, though conveyed in such a manner as should be suitable to the sphere in which he was ordained to move. In consequence of these determinations, our young adventurer led a very easy life in quality of page to the Count, in whose tent he lay upon a pallet, close to his field bed, and often diverted him with his childish prattle in the English tongue, which, the more seldom his master had occasion to speak, he the more delighted to hear. In the exercise of his function, the boy was incredibly assiduous and alert. Far from neglecting the little particulars of his duty, and embarking in the mischievous amusements of the children belonging to the camp, he was always diligent, sedate, agreeably officious, and anticipating; and in the whole of his behaviour seemed to express the most vigilant sense of his patron's goodness and generosity. Nay, to such a degree had these sentiments in all appearance operated upon his reflection, that one morning, while he supposed the Count asleep, he crept softly to his bedside, and gently kissing his hand, which happened to be uncovered, pronounced in a low voice a most fervent prayer in his behalf, beseeching Heaven to shower down blessings upon him, as the widow's friend and the orphan's father. This benediction was not lost upon the Count, who chanced to be awake, and heard it with admiration. But what riveted Ferdinand in his good graces was a discovery that our youth made, while his master was upon duty in the trenches before Belgrade. 2 foot soldiers, standing sentry near the door of the tent, were captivated with the sight of some valuable movables belonging to it, and supposing, in their great wisdom, that the city of Belgrade was too well fortified to be taken during that campaign, they came to a resolution of withdrawing themselves from the severe service of the trenches, by deserting to the enemy, after they should have rifled Count Melvil's tent in the furniture by which they were so powerfully allured. The particulars of this plan were concerted in the French language, which, they imagined, would screen them from all risk of being detected, in case they should be overheard, though, as there was no living creature in sight, they had no reason to believe that any person was privy to their conversation. Nevertheless, they were mistaken in both these conjectures. The conference reached the ears of Fathom, who was at the other end of the tent, and had perceived the eager looks with which they considered some parts of the furniture. He had penetration enough to suspect their desire, and, alarmed by that suspicion, listened attentively to their discourse, which, from a slender knowledge in the French tongue, he had the good fortune partly to understand. This important piece of intelligence he communicated to the Count at his return, and measures were immediately taken to defeat the design, and make an example of the authors, who, being permitted to load themselves with the booty, were apprehended in their retreat, and punished with death, according to their demerits. Chapter 5.